We currently make a diagnosis of Parkinson's based on 3 core motor features. This will be familiar to most of you. Slowness or bradykinesia, rigidity or stiffness, and tremor. But these symptoms progress with increasing disability, both physical and mental. And although we have symptomatic treatments, predominantly for the movement symptoms, there is no cure and no drug that we know of that demonstrably changes the underlying disease process. This disease process comes about through a loss of cells in the brain. A particular part of the brain, called the substantia nigra, is most affected. And the net effect of this is that a chemical called dopamine is depleted within the brain. Once there's been cell loss to the tune of about 50 or 60%, the motor symptoms upon which we base the diagnosis are clear and manifest, and the diagnosis is made. This graph shows age in years along the bottom and percentage of cells in those important parts of the brain up the side. It shows that normal aging is associated with cell loss, but the Parkinson's patients lose their cells at a greater rate and in more specific areas. To reiterate that point, the classic symptoms are established once there's been 50 to 60% cell loss, but there are symptoms at a time when there's been lesser cell loss, and if we could identify people at this stage, then potentially we could use drugs that alter the trajectory of Parkinson's, and this would constitute what we know as neuroprotection or disease modification. We need to access this early stage of Parkinson's to offer better treatments for Parkinson's. To do so, we need to be able to predict who's going to get diagnosed. Age is a really important factor here. We know that risk of Parkinson's increases as people age. At the age of 60, about 0.25% of people have Parkinson's. At 65, about 0.5%, right up to about 3.5% at 85. Age is a very strong risk factor. This is data from the World Health Organization Public Health Challenges, which estimated that between 2005 and 2020, the burden of cardiovascular disease would increase by 7%, but the burden of Parkinson's and Alzheimer's and other dementias would increase by about 20%. These are all age-related illnesses. And of course, the world's population is aging, and that largely underpins this. This data from the Global Burden of Disease study showed that since 1990 up to 2013, there's been a 30% increase in Parkinson's, even after accounting for age. So there's something else driving this process, or more than one thing. Interestingly, only a few other conditions in this report have increased to a similar or greater extent over the same time period, and I list some of them here. We don't know all the factors that increase your risk of Parkinson's, but something's driving this other than age. So on this graph, I show the magnitude of risk along the bottom, some things associated with reduced risk, and then increasing risk across here, and the frequency of these factors in the general population, how common they are in the older adult population. These environmental risk factors are associated with an increased risk of Parkinson's, head injury, pesticide exposure in observational studies. And those factors that are associated with a reduced risk of Parkinson's, coffee and alcohol, cigarette smoking, and elevations in a chemical in blood called urate that's associated with gout. There are a number of symptoms that occur prior to a diagnosis of Parkinson's, and if you have them, your risk of Parkinson's appears to be increased. These include constipation, problems with mood such as anxiety or depression, anosmia, which describes loss of sense of smell, and a specific type of sleep disorder known as RBD. It stands for rapid eye movement sleep behavior disorder. And if you have this sleep disorder, albeit rare in the general population, it actually carries a very high risk of becoming Parkinson's or something like Parkinson's. Those motor features upon which the diagnosis is currently based do not emerge overnight. There is likely to be subtle changes in stiffness, tremor, perhaps changes in walking before a diagnosis is made. And we also know of genetic risk factors. The most common known genetic risk factor for Parkinson's is mutations in a gene called GBA. And then mutations in genes such as LRRK2, PARK2, PINK1, and DJ1, albeit rarer, are associated with a much greater increase in risk and can cause Parkinson's by themselves. So how can we detect these early symptoms? Well, there are a number of ways we can do this. Here I'm going to show you a finger tapping test that we developed a few years ago. It's called the brain test. People hit the S and semicolon key on a keyboard as fast and as accurately as they can over a 30-second period, and it gives a score of speed and accuracy. We compared patients with Parkinson's to people without Parkinson's, and we saw very clear differences between them. But you see that some of these controls are actually in the Parkinson's range. One wonders what will happen to them in the future. We set up the PredictPD portal at predictpd.com. The aim of the PredictPD study is to try and identify a group of people that are going to be at risk of future Parkinson's. People register with the web portal, they consent, and then they submit information through questionnaires and surveys. They do our tapping test. We send them a smell test in the post. They complete the answers to the smell test online. Now, this pilot study, and it's still in a pilot phase right now, opened on this day 6 years ago and was supported by Parkinson's UK from the off. We recruited around 1,300 eligible individuals at that time, and to be eligible, you needed to be between the age of 60 and 80 years old and reside in the UK. And so when they answer these questionnaires, they get a risk score. We don't tell people what their risk score is, we keep that to ourselves, but we rank them, and we take the general population with all different risks of Parkinson's, pass them through the PredictPD portal, and sort them out into a high-risk group, a middle-risk group, and a low-risk group. And then we undertake comparisons between the extremes of risk. The first thing we did when we risk stratified people, we wanted to show that high-risk people really were high risk. So we thought, how can we do this? We looked at the symptoms that we thought were most likely to happen prior to a diagnosis of Parkinson's disease happening. The things we thought were most likely to happen is that people would lose their sense of smell, they may develop this sleep disorder, RBD, and they may slow down on the tapping test. So importantly, at the very first stage of this project, we left those things out of the prediction process. We based the risk score on things like age and gender and constipation and smoking habits and things like that, a whole range of factors, but we left those things out. And then we undertook comparisons between the highest risk and the lowest risk, with the hypothesis being that if the high-risk people really are high risk, more of them should have lost their sense of smell, more of them should have the sleep disorder, more of them should have slow finger tapping. I mentioned already that the movement symptoms don't appear overnight, and so we also hypothesized that if the high-risk group really are high risk, then a proportion of them, greater than the lower risk, should have subtle changes in movement that look a bit like Parkinson's, but don't yet amount to it. And we also wanted to show differences in the appearances of brain scans. We used two types of brain scan that I'm going to talk to you about. Again, comparing high and low risk groups. Ultimately, over time, we want to show that the higher risk group, those people with higher risk scores in the baseline year, are more likely to be diagnosed with Parkinson's during follow-up. This is when we start to really get a feel for a group of people that could go into a clinical trial to try and prevent the diagnosis of Parkinson's. So to share some of the results so far, when we look at the higher risk group, we see smell loss in about a third of them, slowed finger tapping also in about 30%. These groups overlap, but not completely. They also report symptoms consistent with this sleep disorder in about a quarter, and really importantly, as I say, risk score in the baseline year, the first year they did it, is associated with diagnosis of Parkinson's at 3 years and 4 years and 5 years of follow-up. I went to see about 200 of these participants in their own home, about 75 or so in the high-risk group and the rest in a combined middle and low-risk group. And when I went to see people, I videoed them. And then I showed the video to movement disorders experts who rated the features on the video. I want to share one of the videos with you today. I'll talk you through it. This is participant 2. I've anonymized her.
19, 18, 17, 16,
We're just counting backwards. We're looking for a tremor, 13, which there is 12, no tremor.
11, 10.
And make nice wide tapping movements.
Look at her finger taps. There's a subtle breakdown in the finger taps there, okay? She taps, and then she comes up, and then she comes down again. Whereas on the left side, the finger tapping is very smooth. There's no breakdown there at all. So that was on the right side, we saw a breakdown in the finger tap.
Each finger tap the thumb.
It all looks fine to me.
Good, and on the left side?
But these things are really subtle. And we'll see her walking now. And when she walks, again on that right side, she holds the right arm slightly flexed compared to the left side. The left arm swings quite freely, but as she comes back here, that right arm is flexed. That's the same arm where there was the breakdown in the finger tapping. This is her handwriting. We always get people to write the same thing. Mary had a little lamb, its fleece was white as snow. 3 times. And you can see a change in the size of the word Mary, both the length of the word and the height of the word. Same with lamb, same with was. This looks like the beginnings of Parkinson's handwriting. Now, I'm not saying this lady is going to get Parkinson's. I'm not even going to say if she's in the high or low risk group. But she demonstrates the kind of signs that we were looking out for. And in the high risk group, about 30% of the participants have those kind of signs. And in the low risk group, it's only about 5%. On to brain scans. 2 types of brain scan. The first is ultrasound. Put an ultrasound probe on the side of the head, and we look at the central brain structures here. You can make out a black butterfly in the center. This is called the midbrain. There's a white area within the midbrain, which we think is the substantia nigra, the most affected part of the brain in Parkinson's. Here is a scan that I did in a patient with Parkinson's. You can make out this black butterfly here, and I've circled these bright white areas in the middle, in the region of the substantia nigra. This bright, large white area is a characteristic feature of Parkinson's. Now comparing the low-risk group to the higher risk group, not people with Parkinson's, low risk and high risk. You see that in the low-risk group, there's a very small, not particularly bright area in the region of the substantia nigra. But in the high-risk person, a big, bright, white area that looks very much like Parkinson's, but this person does not have Parkinson's disease yet. We saw very clear differences between the high and low-risk groups using this brain scan. Another type of brain scan that would perhaps be more familiar is the DAT scan. DAT scan uses a weekly radioactive injection to highlight the parts of the brain that handle dopamine, the striatum. A normal appearance on a DAT scan is indicated by 2 inverted commas. Okay, you see the tails of the inverted comma here, and it's symmetric. This is a normal scan. This participant came to take part in our study as well. You see he's lost the tails of his inverted commas. They've become more punctate. They look like full stops. And in fact, this gentleman had signs at that time sufficient to make a diagnosis of Parkinson's, which we did. But this other participant in the high-risk group, he hasn't lost the tails quite, but this side seems to have lost a little bit, and it's certainly asymmetric. And actually, again, just like with the ultrasound, we see differences between the high and low-risk group using DAT scan as well. We used DAT scan as the outcome, and we used all the other risk factors that we know about that we've used previously to try and work out how much of the DAT scan binding we can explain. The risk score that we use currently only explains about 7% of the DAT scan, those appearances. The REM sleep behavior score, the questionnaire that picks out the symptoms of RBD, explains about 9%. And the finger tapping score, the brain test score, 9%. The smell test score is 18%. When you combine these online assessments, they explain, may not look impressive, but it is, 26% of the variation in these DAT scans. And so let me put this into context for you. These are not patients with Parkinson's. We are looking at things that we think are associated with an increased risk of Parkinson in people that otherwise look healthy. And we're seeing that they explain a substantial amount of the variation in a marker that we think changes before people get a diagnosis of Parkinson's. And some of these things will occur quite a long way out from the diagnosis. So I'm not surprised that the risk score is, the risk score may change 10 years before you get a diagnosis, or maybe abnormal 10 years before you get a diagnosis. And I wonder if there's a bit of a gradient here in this, and that these things become abnormal the closer you get to a diagnosis. I try and explain this in another way. This is time along the bottom. I've divided time into 3 different areas. The pre-Parkinson stage, where maybe you just have risk factors but no features. The early Parkinson stage, where you have symptoms, but you don't yet have those motor signs upon which the diagnosis is made, along this line here, and this phase after diagnosis. With the ultrasound, we know that people with Parkinson's have that signal before they get the diagnosis, maybe 5 years, maybe 10 years before. and that signal is exactly the same 5 years after Parkinson's. This is a static marker of Parkinson's risk. It doesn't change over time, but it is associated with Parkinson's. And people that don't get Parkinson's, well, they probably never have that marker. And I think at all points that you measure this, you will see differences between these two groups. Using the DAT scan, we know that there's an age-related change in the binding of DAT scan in the striatum, the dopamine handling area. We know that that changes over time. But in Parkinson's, it changes more quickly and in an asymmetric fashion. Now, I think at this stage of Parkinson's, in the pre-Parkinson stage, perhaps before you have any signs, you'll have these normal inverted commas. But as you get closer to the diagnosis, I think this will change. This is not a static marker. This is moving. This is something we can measure. This is a biomarker. To put the whole study to date into context, we started off with 1,300 people about 5 or 6 years ago. Every year we've calculated the highest risk group based on the answers that they give us in the questionnaire. And we've undertaken various analyses to prove that those people really are high risk. We use 15% of the top 15% of risk scores to define the high-risk group. And that means that at baseline, we started with 200, and now 5 or 6 years into follow-up, probably that number in the high-risk group is about 120. These are fairly small numbers, okay? And within this study, only 10 have been diagnosed with Parkinson's. So you see, while we're demonstrating that we can, to an extent, predict Parkinson's, we're doing it in very small numbers. And what we really need to do now is move to a bigger stage. If we want to do clinical trials in the pre-diagnostic phase of Parkinson's, before the diagnosis, then we need to put really large numbers of people through this prediction process so that we can get a group big enough that we could recruit them to a clinical trial to try and show a reduction in the rate of new diagnoses. So where do we want to go now? We want to expand this cohort of about 1,000 to 10,000. That means that at 5 years, we'd have 100 people with diagnosed Parkinson's and many, many more in the pre-diagnostic phase, sufficient numbers to put in a clinical trial. We want to refine the prediction process. This prediction process that we're doing at the moment is the crudest it will ever be. And there are lots of ways that we can improve that prediction process right now. We've got one marker that we think is robust and working. We need more biomarkers, more imaging biomarkers, cheaper ones as well, and laboratory markers too. Maybe in blood, maybe in spinal fluid, maybe in saliva, or maybe skin swabs. Some of our participants may never get a diagnosis of Parkinson's, but it doesn't mean the disease isn't taking place in their brain. They're just not manifesting sufficient symptoms outwardly. So we want our participants to consider donating their brains so that after they die, we can look and see if those high-risk people that we thought were high risk have the beginnings of Parkinson's disease in the brain. And we've started this year to ask people if they'd be willing to do this. We're applying our prediction process to specific groups. We're applying it to those that have just been diagnosed with Parkinson's to see how they look. In people with unexplained smell loss, we've got a good group of that, a good-sized group of these people now, and also in a group of people with this sleep disorder. These may be particularly important groups that are relatively homogeneous, relatively similar to one another. In the future, I hope that we will one day be able to predict Parkinson's with confidence. I believe that prediction is key, not the only thing, but is key to testing new and better treatments that slow Parkinson's. And in the future, it will allow people to be treated with drugs that slow the progression of the disease at the earliest possible opportunity when the most brain cells are still preserved. Thank you very much.